gonna try that. All right. I hope people can hear me. So, yeah, I hope people can hear me, and it isn't coming too low. But anyways, today's topic is the progress of the other, and how we're going to understand this other in terms of Hegel, Carl Jung, Freud, everything else. I think it's good to go back and talk about the mythological narratives that we began with, like Satan and angels and human beings and so on. And I think to kind of give a more digestible understanding of the other, I think it's best to talk about how we begin with, how can I put this? We should talk about good and evil, because then we could talk about Nietzsche, and then beyond good and evil, and what he could be implying in this. And so if we go to the creative theological narrative about what does evil really mean, and typically we've associated that in a theological form, such as things like not obeying God, right? Not obeying God and so on. But if we were to take the theological conception away, what does evil really mean? And the only way that we can understand what evil really means is looking at when it first began in the narrative format of the Bible, the Quran, and so on. And the example that I'm going to use is the Quranic example of when God made the human being out of clay and then asked everybody else to bow to the human being. And who was the one that refused? Well, the one that refused was Satan. And why did Satan refuse? In the Quranic narrative, he refused because he was made of fire and the human being wasn't. And he said that fire was greater than clay. So when we look at this refusal it's the refusal to acknowledge the other, right? But this is a very superficial acknowledgement of the other, right? It's a refusal to acknowledge the other. But then there's another story about the angels in the Quranic narrative, where the angels are told to bow down to the human being. Well, actually, before they're told to bow down to the human being, the angels are asking God, why are you creating a human being that's going to cause all this bloodshed in the world, and so on and so on? And God basically says, you don't know what you can't understand, right? This is kind of beyond your understanding. Now, what is it that the angels are doing? So the angels eventually agree, right? So what ends up happening is that they acknowledge the other. But this is a very superficial acknowledgement of the other. And so when we do these comparisons about how this is breaking down, is that we can look at the angels like people that submit superficially to theology, right? They don't know why, but they were told to, so they submit otherwise, right? They just submit. But then the devil, right, Satan, he doesn't submit because he refuses to acknowledge the other. But then and then of course the great theological question that is always asked is, well, when Satan refused to submit, why wasn't he eliminated on the spot? Why isn't he just, God could just vanish him immediately. But then God punishes him. Why does God punish him instead? He says he brings him down to the human being. Right? He brings him down to the human being. So what happens is there's now two contraries on earth from paradise. There's two contraries on earth now. There's Satan and humanity. Why are we here to acknowledge? Why are we? It's funny because for Satan, for God, right? It's a punishment. Why is this a punishment? And the more that we look at this, and I've been reflecting on this, it's a punishment because it's not actually a punishment. And that's what's really baffling about the whole thing, is that it seems like contraries, the devil and humanity and so on. And this is kind of what the mythological God wants us to realize. The mythological God wants us to realize that there is no other. And this is why Nietzsche talks about going beyond good and evil. Because to go beyond good and evil is to acknowledge that there is no other. Because good and evil have always been set up as contraries from each other. And this is what the role of the devil and the role of Satan will play. And humanity. And so, but I think the angels and the devil is a really good understanding of when we compare theology and science. Because in science, they're very obsessed with not acknowledging the subject. They don't want to acknowledge the subject. So they refuse the other. And then in the angel sort of mentality, they simply submit to the other, right? There is no real understanding about why they're submitting to the other. So when we look at the angel and devil narrative, it's very similar to the way we portray the science and theological controversy, right? The sort of beef between them. That one simply submits to the other, and science refuses to acknowledge the other. But the whole point is the whole point of talking about the absolute with Hegel is that there is no other. There is no other, and that's why it's so hard to comprehend the theological narrative about, well, why didn't God just eliminate Satan on the spot? Why did he allow evil to exist? Right? Why is he allowing this to happen? And in my opinion, it would seem, if we were to stick with the theological narrative, the only punishment is like that we are still refusing slash submitting to this idea of the other. And really that's the punishment. The punishment is the things that we create between ourselves, the otherness that we create between ourselves. Because if you are to refuse the other, you're still acknowledging the other, and that's the whole funny paradox about the whole thing, is you're still acknowledging the other, even in the midst of your refusal of it. That's what always makes me laugh about these theories of everything. They're saying that they're being very objective. This is the theory of everything. Yet it's the subject itself that's telling me the theory of everything, saying that it's objective. So how do we begin with understanding the progress? And this is, of course, the whole point of Hegel, is that the whole thing is the progress. The whole thing is it's not a finished product, and that's the whole point. And so if I were to do this sort of if I were to do the comparison, I don't want to do that comparison. I mean, I was thinking about doing a comparison with the absolute, saying that it is the paradise. I think I could say that, but again, it's this. So we have these weird contraries where there's the refusal of the other, and then there's the blind submittance of the other. It's either way, it's both of them are both egotistical. And this is what Freud will teach us in his interpretation of dreams, where all the manifest content in the dream is egotistical, right? You will always see something other than you, and it's egotistical. You have to, the whole point that Freud's trying to make in his interpretation of dreams is that the way you decipher the dream is you have to find the ego that's hidden in it. And so where is the ego hidden in that dream? And what is it trying to say? But of course, dreams always seem so hard to understand, is because we always look at it like, well, there's, in my dream, I saw a dragon and, all this other stuff. So, but what Freud tries to put is, where do you find the ego in that dragon? And so I guess in some sense, we could say that what Freud teaches us is that there's no such thing as contraries in the dream. And it's the same thing with talking about the absolute. There is no other. To think that there is an other is to fall into the same mistake. And what is really painful about this, as to kind of give a more personal example, is that when I feel that I'm lacking something and I don't have it, I'm acknowledging the other. And when I acknowledge that other, it's painful. In my opinion, this is exactly the punishment, the hellscape of our being, is that we're always acknowledging the other. And then the other hellscape is our constant refusal of the other. Because in our refusal of the other, we're just kind of blinding ourselves, trying to say that, oh, the other doesn't exist, but we're still acknowledging the other in our refusal of the other. We could call this a kind of like avoidance, right? I sort of my responsibility drive, where one wants possession of the other and the other person wants avoidance of the other. But the middle way, you could say, is the witnessing that there is no other. There's nothing to avoid and there's nothing to possess. That it is within itself. But of course, this is the sort of progress that we have to make. And I know I said I talked about Freud, or I talked about Hegel, Carl Jung. Okay, Carl Jung will always say that we are we don't know who we are, so we have to look through the collective, kind of sift through the collective, and find what's ours. And this is what's interesting about Carl Jung. We have to sift through the collective to find what's ours, and then when we once become conscious of ours, then we can go back into society and become a better part of the collective. This is the absolute, basically. Carl Jung is saying in many ways that the subject is always in relation to the other, and the other is always in relationship to the subject, but then it's always, at the end of the day, it's always one big thing. It's a part of the whole process. The collective, the individual is a part of the whole process. And you're never really separate from that. So this idea of individuation is just to become better part of the collective. To basically, in a way to say it, and to do a comparison, is when Carl Jung talks about to individuate, it's to actually, he talks to individuate is the absolute, really. I mean, that's really what it is, because on a big scale, that's what it would mean. Because to understand your personal repressed contents and then go back into society to return and then become a part of that collective is to, again, make that collective better, improve it. That would be the way the absolute functions, in some sense, right? And then the more people that individuate would improve, go back to the collective and improve the entire process. So the subject is the fundamental aspect of the collective, but then the collective is also the fundamental aspect of the individual. So, but I think I've said enough there. Yeah. I think that's all I want to say. All right, guys, take care.